These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? On examination of what white attacks, you see his rook on the c-file aimed through the pawn on c6 and the queen behind it. The pawn is pinned relatively since it can't move without exposing the queen. The greatest value of pinning a pawn lies in your power to take something it protects. Here the pinned pawn protects the rook on b5, but the only piece white can use to take the rook is his own queen. Thus after the sequence 1. Queen takes rook, pawn from c6 takes queen, 2. Rook takes queen, rook takes rook, white hasn't gained any material. It would all be different, though, if black's queen were loose. The first thought thus might be to capture or drive away the rook on a8, but white has no way to achieve this. There is another way to loosen the queen, though, rather than driving its guard away from it, drive it away from its guard. Of course you need to keep black's queen on the c-file to preserve the pin you are trying to create, but if it could be drawn forward to c7, it would be loose and the pin would work fine. One way to attract a piece onto the square you wanted is to put one of your own pieces there in a way that invites or requires its capture. The resource white can use for the purpose is his knight, via knight moves to c7. Examine what threat the move would make and see that it forks black's rooks. As a color scan would have showed you anyway, the knight is on a light square, and so are both black rooks. So black might play queen takes knight to avoid losing the exchange. Yet then he loses it anyway because now white can play queen takes rook. If the pawn on c6 moves, white plays rook takes queen without worrying about a recapture. In this case there already was a relative pin in place at the start, but it was weak. Since black's queen had protection, and since white could only take advantage of the pin by throwing away his own queen, there was nothing to be made of it. Loosening black's queen changed the profit structure of the pin, as it were, and made it much more powerful. We have talked about 3 different ways of loosening a piece in the rear to create or improve a pin in front of it: capturing the rear piece and allowing a recapture by a piece that then is loose, going after the defender of the rear piece by taking something else it protects. Attacking the defender directly is a possibility as well, of course, and drawing the piece away from its protector by putting a threatening piece and prize to it and attracting it forward on the line of the pin. Be mindful of all these techniques. They are useful methods for creating loose enemy pieces in many circumstances, as we have seen elsewhere, and loose pieces are your fondest sight as a tactician. They make a fine basis for a fork, a discovery, or a pin. White to move. What is the best move? Here's a different application of our current logic. White already seems to have the makings of a pin of black's bishop, but it's not quite there because the piece behind the bishop black's d8 rook is protected by black's other rook on a8. Thus black's bishop can move without worry. How can white improve on this? It would be nice if he could loosen the black rook on d8, but he can't. What he can do, however, is play his own rook on h4 to d4. This has the same consequence as loosening the rook on d8, because now that rook has two pieces aimed at it and still is protected just once. This means the bishop no longer can move freely. White takes it next move with rook takes bishop. Here we see an alternative to loosening a piece in order to create a pin in front of it. Instead you can amass enough force to make the piece in the rear overmatched if the piece in front of it moves. White to move. What is the best move? Unpack the cluster of pieces in front of black's king. Actually there are two pins here. One is obvious if you look methodically at what white currently attacks with his sliding pieces. His bishop on g5 pins the f6 knight to black's queen. The other is less obvious. Notice that white's queen attacks black's knight on f5, and that behind this knight is another one on f6. If that rear knight on f6 were loose, the knight in front of it obviously would be pinned. But the knight in front equally is pinned. If moving it would cause the piece behind it to be overmatched. The rear knight currently is attacked twice and defended twice. If black moves away the knight on f5, the knight on f6 suddenly is attacked 3 times, since an attack by the queen has been added. White will take it immediately. So the knight on f5 is pinned, too. White can use everyone's favorite way of exploiting a pinned piece. He can attack it with a pawn. Pawn from g2 moves to g4. If it moves, the knight behind it is lost as just discussed. If black instead plays pawn from h5 takes at g4, white imagines how he might recapture and with what consequences. He could play n-pawn from e5 takes at g4, and now the knight on f6 would be attacked for a third time even without moving the knight in front of it. Again white takes the f6 knight next move. Remember that it's pinned to its queen and so cannot move. Examine this one until it sinks in. Once more the point is to see how a piece can be relatively pinned if moving it would cause the piece behind it to be loose or attacked more times than it is defended. White to move. What is the best move? Other issues that arise in creating relative pins. We turn now to a few mechanical issues that can arise in building relative pins. Most of these involve familiar ideas, only the settings are new. The point to notice here is that black has his bishop and rook arrayed on the same diagonal. White can reach the same line with the c1 bishop. For the idea to work, black's bishop needs to be replaced with something white's bishop can attack without fear, so white performs an exchange, one rook takes bishop, knight takes rook. Now bishop moves to g5 pins the knight that has moved to f6, if the knight moves again, black's loose rook on d8 is lost. Black has no way to add protection to the knight, if he plays his rook to d6 it gets taken, so white gains the piece a move later. You also could have seen this idea by considering any captures you can make. White only has one rook takes bishop, so analysis is simple. The important thing to see is not just that black replies knight takes rook, but that this puts a knight and rook on a dark squared diagonal, poised to be pinned by white's dark squared bishop. White to move. What is the best move? Here is another more advanced application of our current principles. The germ of the idea is on the C file. When you see pieces lined up like this, thoughts of a pin should not be far behind. You see that black's queen is loose and lies behind his knight. White's queen on c2 is aimed through both of them, though white's knight is in the way on c3. The point, you would have a pin if your own knight could be cleared out of the way in a fashion that required a time-consuming reply by black. If there were some simple capture white's c3 knight could make that would call for a recapture by black elsewhere on the board, the solution would be simple: play that exchange, then go after black's newly pinned knight with the pawn thrust. Pawn from b2 moves to b4. The difficulty is that white's knight has no such obvious harm to inflict. An opportunity must be created for it. You might think through the situation backwards in the following way. The most plausible square white's knight can reach with the potential to make a threat is e4, on that post it is safe and could threaten f6, and also would add an attacker against the c5 knight that is the target of these operations. The problem with the threat to f6 is that black has a knight there that can strike back against the knight white is thinking about using for this operation. So maybe white can force a replacement of black's f6 knight by capturing it, bishop takes knight, met with bishop takes bishop. Yes, that leaves a loose piece on f6, so now if white moves his c3 knight to e4, he has a threat against the bishop on f6 that requires a response from black. If black's response is bishop moves to d8, protecting his queen, you play knight takes knight, taking his knight, which now is attacked twice and protected only once. If black instead replies to knight moves to e4 by moving his bishop to e7, the knight is defended twice but now it is pinned, because the queen behind it remains loose, so white can throw the pawn at it with pawn from b2 moves to b4 and win the knight with pawn from b4 takes knight a move later. To summarize, white plays 1. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, performing an exchange on f6 to leave behind a loose black piece that white can attack with his knight. 2. Knight moves to e4, attacking black's loose piece, clearing his knight off of the c-file, and leaving behind a pin on black's c5 knight while also making a second attack on it. Now white has threats against enough enemy targets that he will win a piece no matter what black does. White to move. What is the best move? Another tricky one. Start by looking at and through everything white attacks so that you see what lies behind any possible targets. You notice that his rook on e1 attacks black's bishop, and that behind it is black's queen. The bishop is pinned. One useful thing to do to a pinned piece is take something it guards. Here the pinned bishop protects the rook on d5. White can't take the rook with his queen because his own knight is in the way. The challenge again is to find a violent way to vacate the knight, this time to give black no chance to avoid the coming capture of his rook. Yet white also mustn't disrupt the pieces in the pin. So examine the knight's circle of possible moves, and consider knight moves to c6. It has the needed forcing quality, because it threatens black's queen and also threatens a knight fork. Always the question when you are moving your knight around, at e7, where the piece would attack black's king and rook. If black wants to avoid that result, he has to move the queen where it still can guard the forking square, e7. So suppose he plays it to d7 or g5. Either way, what does white do? Remember the objective, we want the same position as at the start, but with white's knight out of the way, but now black's queen has moved and so has unpinned the bishop. White therefore restores the original position by going ahead and playing the fork knight moves to e7, check. Planting a piece on the square where he wants black's queen to return. If black does capture the knight with his queen, white's mission is accomplished, black's bishop is pinned to his queen again, and now white's queen has a clean line on which to play queen takes rook, winning the exchange after black plays bishop takes queen and white replies rook takes queen. If black doesn't bite and keeps his queen away from e7, white wins the exchange nevertheless by playing knight takes rook. The key to the position is to imagine threats and their consequences. Don't dismiss knight moves to c6 because black's queen then moves. Note where it will move, and what you might do next. Putting one of your pieces on the square where you want an enemy piece to come is a useful technique we have seen before and will see again. It is known as a decoy. By the way, you might have noticed that white's knight is itself subject to a relative pin. When it moves to c6, black has rook takes queen. But this isn't as troubling as it sounds. White can reply knight takes queen, check. At the other end of the board, and since the move gives check, black has to spend a turn relocating his king. This gives white a chance to then play rook takes rook. White wins a rook. White to move. What is the best move? Ganging up on the relatively pinned piece. Once you have found or created a relative pin, the process of exploiting it usually resembles the process of exploiting a piece pinned to its king. The visual appearance is a little different, however, and in any event a few positions to reinforce the basic ideas can't hurt. In the example to the left, white is thinking about using his bishop to inflict a common pin on black's knight with bishop moves to g5. Is it worth the bother? Ask what attacking and defending forces each side would be able to summon to the knight's position. Black could try king moves to g7, defending the knight. White then has with queen moves to h4, adding a second attacker, or queen moves to c3, making the pin absolute. Now black is out of resources, he has nothing else he can use to defend the knight, whereas white's movement of his queen has cleared the way for another attacker. Rook moves to f1. White can aim more pieces at the pin target than black can rally in reply, so eventually the black knight will be lost. The pin is well worth playing for white. As with most of these positions, of course, you should not imagine that all these moves actually would get played. Assuming he anticipates where the sequence is going as well as you do, your opponent has better things to do than swarm reinforcements behind a piece that is a goner. White to move. What is the best move? Does white have a pin in place here? Almost, but not quite. Consider each of his pieces and you can see that his queen seems to pin black's rook to black's queen, but that the black queen has protection, so if the black rook moves, the most white can do is exchange queens. The position would be quite different if black's queen were loose, and this white can achieve by going after its guard. White takes it with bishop takes knight. After black recaptures with pawn from b7 takes knight, the exchange has left the queen without a defender and the rook on d2 pinned, since if it moves white now plays queen takes queen for free. Alright, the next step is to ask how much force each side can bring to the scene of the paralyzed piece, which currently is attacked once and defended once, by a queen on each side. White plays rook moves to d1, and black plays r pawn from a8 moves to d8, a standard summoning of rooks by both players. Does white have any other pieces he can use to attack the d2 square? Yes, bishop moves to c1. Black is out of defensive pieces, so the rook goes to white. White to move. What is the best move? A more demanding position. Look at what white attacks and you see that he has a relative pin in place. His bishop on d4 pins black's bishop to black's queen. Before white starts amassing attackers against the pinned piece, he should improve it. A pin of a bishop by a bishop is nothing much, since black can just play bishop takes bishop. It gets much better if white plays rook takes bishop, inviting rook takes rook, for then white has given away the exchange but has a real pin of black's rook and can get to work ganging up on it. The rook would start out attacked once, by white's bishop, and protected once, by black's queen. The attackers need to outnumber the defenders for the piece to fall. White starts with rook moves to c2 and black replies rook moves to c8, again a common rallying of the rooks on either side to the scene of the pin. Can white bring one more piece to bear? Perhaps his queen, but how? Consider queen moves to b5. This looks dangerous because black remains able to play rook takes queen, causing an exchange of queens to follow. The point to notice, however, is that by moving his other rook over to c8 black has caused the rook on c5 to be caught in a cross pin. If he moves it to the b file, as by playing rook takes queen, White plays rook takes rook c8 plus, and the priority of check means black now will have to waste a move evacuating his king from the back rank. Then white takes black's queen with his bishop. The more likely sequence after 1. Rook takes bishop, rook takes rook, 2. Rook moves to c2, rook moves to c8, 3. Queen moves to b5 is 3. Rook takes rook c2, 4. Bishop takes queen, rook takes eta2, and now black attacks the white bishop on a7 with his rook, and also threatens rook moves to c1, check. With his other rook, which would require white to interpose with queen moves to f1 and thus lose his queen for a rook next move. So notice the work done by black's rook takes eta2, aside from picking up a pawn, it also prepares black to control both of the first two ranks with his rooks if he can play rook moves to c1. White can avoid all this, though, by replying to black's rook takes eta2 with bishop moves to c5, taking his bishop out of danger, since it's then protected by its queen, which is still on b5, and using the bishop to block rook moves to c1. White to move. What is the best move? Taking the protectorate of the relatively pinned piece. Just as was true when we looked at absolute pins, relative pins can be exploited in two general ways, by capturing the paralyzed piece through an accumulation of force against it, or by taking something the paralyzed piece is supposed to protect. We turn now to the latter theme, and in particular the use of relative pins against pawns, a pattern not yet considered, to enable their protectorates to be taken. In the leftward example, follow the lines of attack out from each of your pieces and you see that the white rook attacks a pawn and a rook behind it on the c-file. Since the black rook is loose, the pawn in front of it is pinned, and since the pawn is pinned, the piece it is supposed to protect is loose as well. Thus the target of operations is black's knight on b5, which white takes with knight takes knight. White to move. What is the best move? This position will not be difficult if you remember to scan in all directions, including side to side. For then you see white's rook aimed through a black pawn to black's queen on the 5th rank, which means the pawn on e5 is the subject of a relative pin. The next thought should be automatic: what does the pawn purportedly defend? The knight on d4. So white plays queen takes knight and wins a piece. White to move. What is the best move? As usual, before you make any moves you want to be mindful of what you attack, what enemy pieces or pawns are targeted by yours, and with what significance. Here white's bishop and knight both attack the black pawn on c5. The knight also attacks the pawn on b4. The attack by the bishop is of greater immediate interest because the bishop can impose pins. We therefore look not only at what it attacks but at what lies behind what it attacks, and here we see that behind the c5 pawn is a bishop and it's loose. So if the c5 pawn moves, white takes the bishop, in other words, the pawn is pinned. When you find a pinned pawn, look to what it is supposed to protect that may now be easy prey. In this case the pawn protects another pawn, the one on b4. White takes it with his knight, winning a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? Don't be confused by the compression of the pieces. Just approach them methodically, asking standard questions and tracing through their answers. What does white attack? His rook on e4 attacks the bishop on e5, but the bishop is protected and there is nothing behind it. The rook on b5 attacks the pawn on c5, which also is protected, but this time there is something behind it, a rook, and it's a loose one. So the pawn on c5 is pinned. One thought is to try to take it, but the more fruitful inquiry when you see a pinned pawn is to ask what it protects. Here it protects the pawn on b4, so white takes it for free with his other rook. For the sake of completeness, you would not want to play this until you made sure you were not setting yourself up for trouble from the passed pawn that black ends up with on the b file. After play goes 1. Our pawn from e4 takes at b4, pawn from c5 takes at b4, 2. Rook takes rook, pawn from b4 moves to b3, black has a pawn steaming toward promotion and white has no immediate way to take it. But he has other ways to deal with the problem. For example, he can play 3. King moves to d3 and then meet pawn from b3 moves to b2 with 4. King moves to c2. The pawn on b2 then is stuck, so long as it stays on b2 it is protected by black's bishop, but if it moves to b1 it gets taken. White puts the pawn out of its misery with 5. Rook moves to b5 and 6. Rook takes at b2, a safe capture since the rook takes protection from its king. White ends up with an extra pawn and a 1 endgame. There are other routes to the same outcome as well. The important point is to double check the options your opponent will have when the smoke clears. White to move. What is the best move? Taking the protectorate, more involved cases. To repeat our current theme, when you see a pin of any sort, Consider two ways of exploiting it, by attacking the pinned piece or by going after whatever it protects. In this case, for example, you see the pieces lined up on the b-file and realize that white has a relative pin on black's bishop. The pin creates a pair of potentially vulnerable targets for white to consider, the bishop, because it is paralyzed, and the rook on c3, because it is left loose by the pin. There are, in turn, two general ways to attack a loose target, by piling up more attackers against it than your opponent can counter with defenders, but it's hard to win a piece this way unless it's paralyzed, or by making it the subject of a fork. The idea behind the fork is that you throw an attacker at the target and at the enemy king simultaneously. Your opponent then has no time to add a defender to the target to offset your attack, as he is too busy moving the other piece, hopefully his king. In this case the workable target is the black rook, and the preferred method of taking it is a fork. Your queen is available, so your first thought is to find a square from which it can attack the rook and black's king at the same time. If no such square yet exists, maybe you can make one by playing with checks that force black to move his king and allow you to move your queen around, too. Thus you consider queen moves to e8, check. This forces king moves to g7. Now you follow up with the fork queen moves to e5, check. And take the rook next move. The natural result you might visualize after you take the rook is black's reply bishop takes queen, after which you play rook takes queen and have won the exchange. But actually black can do a little better. After white's queen takes rook, black plays queen takes at g2, check. Picking up a pawn. Black's queen was going to be lost anyway, so he might as well try to take something with it. White responds king takes queen, and then black still has bishop takes queen. The sequence nevertheless remains worthwhile for white, as a rook is much more valuable in the endgame than a bishop that can only patrol squares of one color. This position has more to do with building a queen fork than with pins, but what makes it go is the observation in the first place that black has a loose rook worth forking, and this because his bishop is laboring under a relative pin. The position thus is a good example of how a pin and fork can work together. It also shows yet again the value of having a look at any checks you can give. Even if you overlooked all other patterns at the start of this position, looking for checks and finding queen moves to e8, and then the next check the queen fork queen moves to e5, would have led you in the same direction. White to move. What is the best move? There is nothing new here except the use of the pin. First figure out where the offensive action is for white. You might try looking piece by piece. His rook attacks black's bishop, his bishop attacks black's knight, and his queen attacks the pawn on d6 which has two black pieces behind it. When you see a line arranged like the d-file here, take notice and consider pinning possibilities. It's not just the queen bearing down on the black pieces and pawn that is of interest, it's also the bishop attacking the knight on d7. Taken together these resources suggest possibilities for play on that file, and one way to play on a file is to pin something in the front to something in the rear. So experiment with exchanges you can force. White can initiate one. Bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop. Now white pins black's pawn on d6 to the rook behind it. This is a classic case where a preliminary exchange by white creates a loose piece, drawing the rook forward and away from its guard and thus also creating a pinned pawn in front of it. And the pin of the pawn means black. It means the bishop on c5 can be taken with white's rook. A comparable way to see the idea is to note the lineup of black material on the d-file and ask whether white's queen has a pin because of it. The answer is no, but why? Because the knight behind the d-pawn is protected. One way to loosen such a piece is to take it and cause it to be replaced by a piece that then is loose. White uses that method here with bishop takes knight. White to move. What is the best move? Ask what white attacks. There are three answers: his rook on g1 attacks the knight on g4, his bishop on d3 attacks the bishop on g6, and his queen on h3 attacks the pawn on h5. All three possibilities are useful and important. The first thing to see about them is that white has the makings of a pin on the h-file, as his queen bears down on black's pawn and then also a piece behind it. This is of particular interest because the h5 pawn is all that guards the black knight that your rook would otherwise be able to take. What prevents the pin from succeeding is the protection the rook takes from the black king. White's threat to take the rook with his queen isn't scary so long as the rook is guarded. The challenge is clear: interrupt that protection. We know a few ways to do this. One is to distract the guard by taking something else it protects. In this case the king also guards the bishop on g6. So white plays 1. Bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop. This leaves the rook loose and thus causes the pawn on h5 to be pinned. Now white can play rook takes knight, check. If black recaptures with pawn from h5 takes rook, white takes black's rook with his queen and still has won a piece. As you can see, the idea of loosening a screened piece to create a pin of whatever lies in front of it has great practical importance. Whenever you see enemy men lined up in front of one of your attackers, consider whether loosening one of the rear ones by any of the means we have considered here would leave the one in the foreground pinned and useless as a defender. Black to move. What is the best move? A pawn in the middle of the board with opposed rooks on either side of it, like white's pawn here on d4, is a natural candidate for a pin. What makes the pin work for black, of course, is that white's rook on d1 is loose. This amounts to an offensive opportunity. The d4 pawn is defensively inert, so black should search for ways to seize whatever it is meant to protect. It is meant to protect white's knight on e5, so study the knight and ask whether it can be taken. Not quite. If black plays pawn from f7 moves to f6, the knight simply moves. And black can't take the knight with his h8 bishop because the knight has one other guard in the pawn on f4. What is to be done? Since black has the prospect of winning a whole piece, he can afford to make a sacrifice to get rid of the f4 pawn. He simply takes it with knight takes at f4. After white recaptures rook takes knight, white's knight has no guard other than the pinned d4 pawn, which is to say it is loose. Black plays bishop takes knight and wins a pawn with the sequence. The structure of the position is simple. A piece that white seems to protect with two pawns actually is protected by just one. So if black takes the pawn, allows a recapture, and then takes the piece the pawn was supposed to protect, he ends up ahead a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? White's rook aims down the d-file, where black has a pawn and then a queen behind it. The pawn almost is pinned, leaving the knight on e5 loose. The only obstacle to the pin is that white's own knight is in the way. Toy with vacating it violently so your opponent will have to spend a move on his response. The simplest way to move a piece violently is with a capture, so white looks for things his knight can take and plays knight takes at b6. Indeed, this not only is simplest but also is most profitable. If black decides now to move his queen and avoid the pin, white at least has used the threat of the pin to win himself something a pawn. If black instead opts to recapture with pawn from c7 takes knight, the pawn on d6 is pinned and white can play queen takes knight, check. If black then recaptures with pawn from d6 takes queen, white plays rook takes queen, winning back his queen and again netting a pawn with the sequence. Do not turn up your nose at the gain of a pawn. But the larger lesson to take away from the position is the look of the d-file, the pinning possibility it contains, and the implications of the pin for the knight on e5. It would be easy to miss this in game conditions. White to move. What is the best move? Put together the lessons of the last few positions and you have this one. Ask what white attacks. His bishop on h3 attacks black's knight on d7. His rook on d1 attacks nothing as such, but is aimed down the d-file where black has a pawn, a knight, and a rook. White's power directed at the d-file suggests that he consider play there and keep pinning possibilities in mind. What stands in the way of a good pin? White would need to clear his own pawn on d4 out of the way, but that can be done easily enough with a capture. Pawn from d4 takes at e5. The other problem is that behind what black has in front on the file, his pawn at d6, he has a piece that is protected. As we know, a routine motif in creating a relative pin involves loosening one enemy piece that lies behind another. Can black's knight on d7 be loosened or replaced with a loose piece? Of course, that is the significance of white's bishop on h3. White plays bishop takes knight, and when black replies rook takes bishop, he now has a loose rook on d7 behind his d6 pawn. The pawn would be pinned if white's own pawn were out of the way, so now it's time for pawn from d4 takes at e5. Black recaptures pawn from f6 takes at e5. White has created a classic relative pin on black's pawn at d6, so he takes what it is supposed to protect, knight takes at e5, winning a pawn and improving his knight's position. Notice how this position combines the ideas in this section, accounting for all of the attacks white can make, and seeing how they might be coordinated, identifying a latent pinning possibility on a file where white directs force, even though the possibility is obscured because white's own pawn is in the way and black's screened piece is guarded, methodical loosening of the piece on the screened square with an exchange, and then violent evacuation of the file by white's pawn that had been in the way. All this to win a pawn. Incidentally, if you're alert, you might wonder whether black can escape trouble by replying to white's initial bishop takes knight with pawn from e5 takes at d4, taking a pawn and making a counter threat against the knight on c3. After this move it looks like black will be able to take either white's knight or his bishop next move, and without stepping into a pin in the process. But white has a clever answer, bishop takes at c6, winning back the pawn and creating a fresh threat, perhaps a counter threat against black's bishop on b7. Now black has to play bishop takes bishop, or else suffer it himself, after which white has knight takes at d4. In this variation white thus wins a pawn, just as he does with the primary sequence considered above. White to move. What is the best move? Breaking a relative pin, moving the screened piece. Breaking out of a relative pin is easier than breaking out from an absolute pin, of course, because there are many more options. The pinned piece legally can move, and sometimes the benefits of doing so may be great enough to offset the loss of the piece exposed to capture. And the screened piece, unlike the king, can move more than one square at a time, and so may be able to both end the pin and launch an attack of some sort that leaves no time for the formerly pinned piece to be taken. Here, as when we studied ways of breaking absolute pins, the lessons are important for those occasions when you may find yourself the victim of such a tactic and need a way out, but it also is important to understand them so you will know when a pin you are contemplating will succeed. We will start with a series of positions where a relative pin may, or may not, be broken by moving the screened piece. In this first example white doesn't attack anything much. But what can white attack on his next move, and what patterns do you see in black's position? Notice black's knight and queen lined up on the same diagonal, and realize white can play bishop moves to b5, pinning the knight. Would the move result in any gains? If you just consider the forces that each side can bring to bear on the pinned piece, it might seem promising. White next will be able to play his queen to a4 so that he has two pieces trained on the knight, whereas black has nothing to use in defending it except his queen. There is, however, another question to ask: could black interrupt white's sequence by moving one of the two pieces out of the pin? Normally black wouldn't dare move his queen, because while it is causing the knight to be pinned, it also is the only thing preventing the knight from being captured. One exception we will see later is when the screened piece here, the queen can leave its square with a threat. Another exception, and the saving option in this case, arises when the screened piece can move out of the pin while still protecting the pinned piece. Thus after white's bishop moves to b5, black looks for another square for his queen from which it can guard the knight. He finds a8 and moves his queen there. The pin is dissolved and the knight still is protected, so now if white tries to gang up on the knight with queen moves to a4, black can simply move it to safety. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's knight on e5 is pinned to his rook. This causes black to ask what offensive threats either his pinned or screened piece could make by leaving their squares. He searches for one that would buy time, just a move that would allow him to take the other piece out of harm's way. 2. In this case the answer is easy if you practice an awareness of any loose pieces on the board, for then you are drawn to white's bishop on c2. It is a simple matter for black to attack it with his rook via rook moves to c8. Now if black's knight gets taken, so does white's bishop. If white doesn't like this, he can move the bishop, but then black has time to move his knight. The pin is ruined. That's the simple answer. A more complex possibility is worth noting as well. Suppose black instead plays knight takes knight. Does this break the pin? Consider this as an exercise, the answer will follow in the next paragraph. Okay, the answer is yes. The risk, of course, is that white will reply with bishop takes rook. The question is what reply you could make to this. You look first for a check and see queen moves to c5, a move that also has the useful feature of attacking the loose bishop on c2. This check forces white to either move his king back to h1 or interpose a pawn at d4. If white chooses king moves to h1, black has knight takes bishop b8 and now he has won 2 pieces for his rook. White still has queen takes knight available, but then black still has queen takes bishop c2 as well, and after those captures he still has 3 pieces in return for a piece and a rook. It's about the same if white instead replies to queen moves to c5 with pawn from d3 moves to d4. This time black has to move his queen to prevent it from being taken, so he plays queen takes bishop c2 now and saves the threat of knight takes bishop for his next move. Once more black ends up with 2 pieces in return for a rook. But it's enough if you just grasp the basic principle here, the idea of breaking out of a relative pin by making a threat with one of the pieces involved in it. Black to move. What is the best move? By way of transition, consider now a case where the pinned piece, rather than the screened piece, can break the pin by making a threat. Do you see the pin that is troubling black? His knight on e2 cannot move without exposing his rook, which is loose, to capture by white. And if it were white's turn he would win a piece, as the pinned knight is attacked twice and protected just once. But it's black's move, So look for an offensive option with one of the pieces that is party to the pin, perhaps it can create a sufficient distraction to allow both pieces to escape. Can either piece give check? No. Can either attack a loose white piece? No. What else is there? Always be aware of the enemy king, its constraints and any pressure you are exerting against it, and especially any pieces currently attacking any squares adjacent to it, for that is what mate threats are made of. Here black's other rook on b6 bears down on the b file next to white's king. A move that adds another attack against the b1 square, say, knight moves to c3, would add to the pressure on the king, because it would put black in position to play rook moves to b1 with protection. That threat doesn't quite seem decisive here because white also protects b1 with his rook now on e1. But an idea comes into view: if black plays knight moves to c3, he invites white to execute the pin with rook takes rook, which is fine, because then black would mate with rook moves to b1. White can decline rook takes rook, of course, but he has to do something with his e1 rook because it would be under attack. Probably he would move it to c1, which again suits black fine, for now the pin is broken. Notice, then, all that knight moves to c3 does, it's a discovered attack, unmasking a threat against white's rook by the pinned piece while also launching a fresh threat against the mating square b1. White can extinguish both threats with rook moves to c1, but by then black has escaped trouble.